in this third segment, we'll take a look at some detailed look at this document called the General Principles of Software Validation. This is the initial FDA guidance on medical software, and medical software at the time in the context of a medical device. So again, a reminder, this sort of flowchart of law, regulation, guidance. We're now into guidance. The GPSV is a guidance document. Remember that guidance describes the agency's current thinking on a regulatory issue. It is not legally binding, but it should be taken very seriously. It tells you what the FDA thinks and how software should be validated. And of course, given that they review whether you validate the software correctly, what they think is the appropriate process is something you should take seriously because it's going to impact how they review something that you submit to them. So this is the outline of the document, and this is a picture of it. It's January 11, 2002. This is the revised version. The original version is a few years earlier. They have two initial sections called purpose and scope. Then there's sort of some background theory in this section called context for software validation. We'll zoom in a fair amount in this section called software is different from hardware. It's an important section. We'll spend some time. Then there's something called principles of validation. We'll cover this quickly. Activities and tasks we'll look at quickly, and then we'll return to the sections in this section of the document, the subsections. As we perform these activities and tasks, we'll look back and see what the guidance is. And then the final thing is validation of automated process equipment, external libraries and things, and we'll have one comment to make about that one too. So let's get started, and I will keep this title of contents on the left-hand side of the screen just to orient you as we go through. So the beginning is the purpose. This guidance outlines general validation principles that the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, considers to be applicable to the validation of medical device software or the validation of software used to design, develop, or manufacture medical devices. So this is the purpose. It tells you what you're supposed to do in order to validate software, and by validate software means software that meets the needs of the user. That is the definition of validation. The scope now, and this is where the title of this document is a little bit of a misnomer, and the scope will make this clear. The scope of this guidance is somewhat broader than the scope of validation in the stricter definition of that term, the way we're defining it. So they think that planning, verification, testing, traceability, configuration management, and many other aspects of good software engineering discussed in this guidance are important activities that together help to support a final conclusion that the software is validated. So you could retitle this document as the General Principles of Software Engineering, and you would not be off the bat. So their definition of validation, of course, is much, much broader than the normal definition of validation, at least the way they're scoping this document. So keep that in mind. People look at the title and think, oh, it's about validation, and they go in and discover that half the document is about design and coding, which is a little bit confusing. So how should software be developed? And again, when we talk about a medical software lifecycle and why we use it, here is the origin of it. This guidance recommends the integration of a software lifecycle management and risk management activities into the process. This guidance does not recommend any specific lifecycle or any specific techniques or methods. It does recommend the software validation and verification be conducted through the entire software lifecycle. So what this tells you is you can follow any software lifecycle you want, but you have to have one. It's a basic need. So you have to have a lifecycle. You have to know what step of the process you're in. We're now coding, we're now testing, we're now doing requirements, and you have to do risk management throughout your process. And this is a general guidance. And this is true of much of this vocabulary you see in these guidance documents. They tell you what you should do, but not how you should do it often. You have flexibility in how you meet this guidance, but they tell you what you absolutely have to do. The next comment, and again, this is a critical comment, we're going to come back to this again and again throughout this class, is this comment about software updates and how they get you in trouble. So the FDA analyzed 3,140 medical device recalls. A recall is when something significant wrong is found with a device that has to be taken off the market. They found that a fraction of these were attributed to software failures, and of these, 80% were caused by software defects that were introduced after changes were made to the software after its initial production distribution. So 80% of the problems with software happen in updates, and 20% happen in the original version. And you may be familiar with your computers. The computer's working fine, then you get an update and everything slows down. So please keep this in mind. Updates are a very significant part of the software lifecycle, and updates can be a big source of trouble. So you will see that in the lifecycle, as we come to the end, the maintenance process is treated with the same level of seriousness as the original process of creating the software. And when you hear words about continuously learning algorithm from machine learning, realize that we're talking about updates that are happening continuously. This is a very serious issue that has to be handled with care, because updates can get you in trouble. This is the lesson of history, at least the original study by the FDA. Okay, the context now that software validation happens, this is just some background for you, and this is an acknowledgement by the agency, and anybody who's developed software knows that these processes are difficult because a developer cannot test forever, and it is hard to know how much evidence is enough. In a large measure, software validation is a matter of developing a level of confidence that the device meets all its requirements. So you test until you've tested enough and you feel like you've gotten there. Like the number of bugs is low, it worked in enough cases and things. Now, what is this level of confidence? This is the other part of the regulatory process. The level of confidence and therefore the level of software validation, verification, and testing effort needed will be dependent upon the safety risk posed by the automated functions of the device. So again, the risk classification of the device, what are we using it for? Are we using it in a situation where the output is going to directly impact the treatment of a patient in a serious condition? That requires a very detailed testing regimen because the level of confidence has to be high. If it's something that's less directly affecting a patient or the condition of the patient is not particularly serious, we can get away with a less detailed testing regime, a less detailed design. And those will come over and over again, especially once we start talking about IC 62304, which details some of the steps, the international standard in this process. And this is up there, the classification the FDA uses. We'll come back to this in a couple of segments. Class 1, low to moderate. Class 2, moderate to high risk. Class 3 is high risk. There's a section 3.3, that to my mind is almost the most interesting part of this document. We'll zoom in a fair amount here. We'll have about 5 slides talking about just this. And this is the differences between hardware and software. Remember, all these regulations were written for hardware, and they're adapted for software. So what are the differences between hardware and software? The first one is, of course, that the vast majority of software problems, we're now quoting and paraphrasing from the document, are traceable to errors made during the design and development process. Because unlike hardware, there's no manufacturing process to speak of, right? The end of the design is the software is the product. You don't send it out to a factory. I mean, in the old days, we used to make CDs, but that's basically it. And typically, and this is the second part, and we're going to come back again and again to this point, testing alone cannot verify that the software is complete and correct. In hardware, you often have a relatively simple mechanism. You test it in all possible ways. You say, good enough, it works. Software can have non-linear paths through the system. Different things can happen. We'll talk about the branching problem in a couple of slides. The second set of differences here is that unlike hardware, which wears out, software does not. So software doesn't really get old, unlike hardware, will have microstructural effects. But we can get defects in the software through updates. This is the 80-20 thing we talked about before. And unlike some hardware failures, software failures often occur without advance warning. And this is where we talk about branching statements. So when you look at hardware, you often begin to hear sounds, gears grinding, weird noise, and you know this thing is about to fail. Software, one day works, and the next day, that's the end of it. And the reason for it is that there are things like branching statements. There are parts of the code that were never exercised, and under certain circumstances, you go to a piece of code that you never used before, and all of a sudden, you have a problem. And small changes in the code can create unexpected and very significant problems. And that's because of the inherent nonlinearities in the system. So let's look at this branching statements problem. We alluded to it, so let's just look at it here. So it's a very simple piece of code. We have two variables, inputs, A and B. If A is greater than 2, we go to the right-hand side of this code. If it's less than 2, we go on the left-hand side, and we have another variable, B less than 4, we go to the left, greater than 4, we go to the right. And depending on the combination, we end up in 4 different functions here, right? So if A and B are both small, we get A plus B plus 2. Otherwise, A plus 6, A plus B, A plus 4. So to properly test the software, we have to have 4 combinations to exercise all 4 pieces of this code. Now, this is a trivial piece of code with 2 variables. We can count them. This is pretty easy. If you have anything but the most trivial piece of software, you may have 20, 50, 100 of these things, of which you may only have tested 90%. So all of a sudden now, A goes from, in this trivial example, 2.1 to 1.9, and all of a sudden, instead of being on this side of the code, you're now on this side of the code, which you may never have tested. So this small change can all of a sudden give you a problem. So that's what the branching problem is this introduction of non-linearities into the system. Okay, 2.01, you're going to the right, 1.99, you're going to the left. You're now using a completely different piece of code. One more set of comments about the difference between hardware and software, and this is one of my favorite parts here. This is a sociological comment, if you wish, from the FDA, that the personnel who make maintenance changes to software may not have been involved in the original software development. If the software was developed 10, 20 years ago, the people fixing the code may not have been there at the beginning. And so it's important to have accurate and thorough documentation. And the conclusion of this is that for this and other reasons, software engineering needs an even greater level of managerial scrutiny and control than does hardware engineering. Now, this runs counter to what most people thought at least 10, 15 years ago. Hardware is hard, software is easy. The software guys are writing something straightforward. Let's not worry about them. But the reality of the matter is that the software is all hidden from you. The hardware you can often see. So problems in the software may not manifest themselves, especially until somebody actually starts looking at the code to figure out, well, how do we change this? So documentation is important. Proper documents, proper designs are important, because without those, you may have a working piece of software, but it's software you can never fix, you can never change. And you realize that, those of you who are old enough to have experienced this, if you go back and look at even your own code that you wrote 15 years ago, as happened to me recently, you don't really understand why you wrote things the way you did. So you come back now and think, well, if only there was documentation, if only there were designs, that would help us understand how this process works. The final piece is that testing is insufficient, okay? So software testing is a necessary activity, but in most cases, software testing by itself is not sufficient to establish confidence that the software is fit for its intended use. And this is unlike hardware, of course. So you cannot rely on testing to test quality into the software after it is written. You say, okay, we don't care how it's written, we'll test it to death, we'll make sure it works. The reason, of course, is that all these nonlinear paths in the software, all these if statements means that you can never test it enough. So part of your confidence comes from the design, from the fact that you understand exactly what the thing is doing. It's broken up into small units. The smaller, the better. And as the risk class goes up, you need even smaller units to ensure that you have quality process in place, a quality piece of software that lets you sleep at night, that it will work just fine. The last couple of segments here, the principles of software validation, it's a reminder that one needs a formal specification. You can't really do validation without an established software requirement specification. This is back to our initial myth. The FDA says that the process doesn't start when the time comes to test. You have to have had specifications, because only then you know what it is to test, right? And many startup companies, many new entrepreneurs here are under the false impression, that we first develop the software in some fashions and we'll worry about the FDA when it comes to validating. The regulated process starts at the design. That's what design controls means. That's what the whole process is all about. And you can go back to the segment number 4 of week 1, where we talk about this in a little bit more detail. Section 5, which is a detailed section, actually talks about activities and tasks, and both in quality planning, requirements, designs, coding, testing, maintenance, and changes. This is the software lifecycle in some ways. We will not examine this here in detail, but we'll pick up the thread of each of these things from weeks 5 to 10 when we talk about the individual components of this process. Finally, section 6 talks about external components, and you're going to see this little graphic that we'll see over again when we talk about external components, where software is developed by someone other than the device manufacturer. For example, if you use off-the-shelf software, the software developer may not be directly responsible for compliance with FDA regulations. Instead, the device manufacturer needs to assess the adequacy of the off-the-shelf software activities and examine what additional efforts are needed to establish that the software is validated for the device manufacturer's intended use. So the upshot of this is that we limit dependencies to a minimum here, and we control dependencies explicitly. So the device manufacturer, if you are the producer of the software, you are responsible for code that even you did not write. Let's say you use an open source library that you downloaded, you get code from somebody else. They are not responsible. They just wrote the code, they give it to you. You are the legally responsible party, the manufacturer of record. And so you have to perform the testing process, the review process of the software you're using, the code you're using that came from an outside source. Therefore, what this means is that A, you want to limit your dependencies to a minimum. You don't want to use lots of code that you don't understand, because it's hard to ensure that that works. And you want to control these dependencies explicitly. You don't want low-level system programmers, coders, saying, oh, we need to use this library. Those are decisions have to be made at a higher level, because when you bring in an outside piece of code, you're bringing in all the problems that come with it. Now, there's a balance here. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. We'll come back to this topic again and again as we talk about software design. So, in conclusion, what is an FDA-compatible process looks like? What is the lesson from this regulation? The structure and the environment in which we're working are critical. We must be able to demonstrate that the overall software development process is controlled and follows an actual plan as opposed to ad hoc programming. And to summarize from the presentation I saw online by Carl Virva, it consists of 3 steps. You establish before any programming what we're going to do. We need a plan, we need to follow the plan, and we need to be able to provide documentary evidence that the plan was followed. And those are the 3 steps. Have a plan, follow the plan, and have evidence that you followed the plan. So this concludes our discussion of the GPSV, this original software guidance from the FDA. In the next segment, we'll jump forward 10, 15 years, and we'll look at the guidance on software as a medical device, and that brings us to the modern era of medical software. Thank you.